I would like to start asking Markus, because you have given examples, very concrete examples of, well, the multi-pronged efforts that is necessary to, I mean, it's not only the law, it is also research and so on. But as a civil servant, I would like to ask you specifically about the impact of the 2016 cultural property protection law in Germany. Because as a civil servant in a government agency, you can't just act as you wish. I mean, you always have to have the law behind. And the regulations that, I mean, it is not up to me, it's up to the people in the parliament to decide what I'm allowed to do, what I should focus on. So from your experience, what is the impact of the new legislation? I don't talk just about the legal cases, but would you say that having this legislation has made a difference also for you as a director of a museum or public institution? What is the implication for I mean, the wider work with this?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm a little bit hard put to answer this because it's probably almost too early to have or to be able to feel actual impacts, because the law was put into effect on August 6th in 2016. Then there was a summer break, and the Ministry of Culture is actually still working on a guideline, a 400-page guideline for public institutions, collectors, dealers, that will help them understand what their new responsibilities are and how to behave. So in terms of practical matters, for me it's difficult to say what has changed, also because in my museum nothing has changed, because we've already adhere to the principles that are now the basis of the law. And if you follow the ICAM Code of Ethics, for example, nothing will change for you as a museum. And I'm saying this again, Germany is not a protagonist. Germany is not doing this very quickly. Germany took almost 40 years to start implementing and ratifying the 1970 convention. So I would not pride myself or pride ourselves of saying that we're taking the lead here. Now we are at a point where we think we've found a mechanism, a legal mechanism that allows us to control effectively imports and guarantee effectively the return and restitution of illegally exported artifacts. What impact it will have on the art market, to what degree antiquities dealers may actually be forced out of business, as some have said, to what degree the art market will change its practices, it's hard to tell. What we've noticed is that the art market tries to give more detailed provenance information. When I say more detailed provenance information, it's going from giving no information whatsoever to saying Bavarian private collection, as we saw earlier. So this is not really a significant change for the better. What I'm realizing is, when you ask for the impact, and this would be my last point, is that now it's easier for a public servant, because I'm one too, and a representative of a public institution in Germany to go abroad and to say we're doing something for the protection of cultural heritage. Before then, it was very difficult to say we're serious about this, when at the same time you have to admit you have a law that doesn't work.
Thank you. And I have a question for you, Christos, because I mean you have shown that despite of the UNESCO Convention 1970, and the convention having gathered more and more signature states, not much has changed in relation to practice, that is, of the auction houses, of the collectors, of the specialists, of the academics, and so on. I mean, do you want to leave us with that? Or do you have, I mean, would you, from your point of view, what is the road forward? I mean, you don't have to answer for anyone apart from yourself. What is your what is your thought about this? How to move forward, given this situation after how many years? That is 40
47.
Years? 47 years.
47 years are a lot not to have changed or have changed in a significant level. I think I made clear at the various points of my presentation and at the end of my presentation that in my gut feeling, the way forward is A, mapping the international and monitoring the international antiquities market. It's really good that started in a national level and various projects, both in Germany and Sweden. Various so-called source countries, this is a terminology by the market which itself shows the mentality of the market. They call them source countries, countries from where they can source antiquities in order to sell them. So I'm using the market terminology to say that these kind of countries, these provenance, real provenance countries, or countries of origin, haven't had done a lot in order to clear up their own territory, to map the objects that they have appearing abroad, to have a complete and concrete knowledge of what could claim, under which law, and to make actual moves of claims and repatriations, which for me as a researcher is just the first step in a much wider research. We first have the identification, the repatriation, without which we cannot move forward. Then we are reconstructing the true collecting history of the object, working backwards in time, who bought it from whom, until we reach a significant point that it was, to prove that it was and so on. And then we understand who was involved. And then we understand why was involved and how they operated in that case and in every case. And then we collectively understand how the market works and operates. And then we critically and comparatively understand if something has changed over a specific time. 5 years, a decade, almost half a century since the 1970 UNESCO Convention. I cannot not say, I would very much love to be in a position to say yes, with all these comparative movements based on criminological evidence and then therefore undeniable by the market itself, first of all. I would love to say that there is a big change. Unfortunately, it isn't, and practically this has been proved and continue to be proved. It is an oasis whenever we have the opportunities in national level to have this kind of efforts. I'm very much supporting of the suggestions of Markus and Frida that this should be copied from all countries, market countries, source countries, transit countries. And that relies, unfortunately, on national decisions, while international efforts are mainly of ethical basis, unless they have been taken over in a legislation level by the countries themselves. If not, it stopped. Won't go further forward. So how can we fight it? Actually, actively, and then raising people's awareness, and then making educational programs, and then advertising in airports or elsewhere to help people understand, non-experts, naturally, and so on. Not certain only activities without a total organized way. And this organized way is missing still in an international level.
Thank you. We will probably come back to that during the rest of the discussion.
If I may say,
yes.
Yes, I would like to add something to your question and to what Christos just said, especially regarding source countries, because the 1970 Convention has been ratified by 132 countries, which is 2/3 of UNESCO member states. So it's not the ratification rate of the World Heritage Convention, but still we're getting there. The problem is, as I said before, that the 1970 Convention needs to be transposed into national law, and also this requires a lot of resources, and many source countries, many developing countries, do not have the resources to create police units, even to issue expert certificates, to develop laws, and this also affects, obviously, the international art market. So I think that Christos was focusing rather on what the situation is in art market countries, but we cannot forget that the problem is also in source countries, especially in those which do not have the means. That's why I think it's also very important that UNESCO gives visibility to projects such as the Illicit project in Germany and all the efforts made in Sweden, because these are very good practices which should be applied in art market countries and also serve as an inspiration for source countries. And obviously UNESCO stands ready to help these countries with technical assistance, with capacity building and other efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Anas?
Yeah.
You gave a description of how the antiquities law in Syria helped you as a civil servant, as the director of the National Museum in Raqqa.
Exactly.
And I also know that you have experience from working in Palmyra and Tadmor.
Exactly.
That you were personally...
I participated. I was member of the inventory mission when Khalid al-Assad, the previous director, retired. So we received the museum from Khalid al-Assad and delivered to the new director.
Yes.
So I am familiar with the material from Palmyra.
Yes, because I have a question. You know, as museums, now and then, you get strange questions. No? Not so much about buying. That was some years ago, in 2011, and so you could have one or two questions about buying, but now it is more about, could you tell us what this is, and so on. I was thinking, we were informed here in Sweden that most of the collections from the Palmyra Museum was saved, could be transported away from Palmyra before Daesh occupied the site. But some, we also saw that some were left in the galleries, and some were, what was left, some of it was damaged, and some was looted. I was just thinking, how could we have a practice, I mean, whom to contact if we find something here? How would it be possible to trace an object that had been in the storage of Palmyra? Would that be possible to trace? I mean, were there inventory numbers on it and so on? And whom to contact for us if we have anything? I mean, for the moment it is not the case, but I was thinking of, for us to develop a, practice, how to proceed if we find something that we think probably from Palmyra or some other site in Syria.
So I think the best way is have contact with the General Directorate of Antiquities and Museums, since the Directorate is the official authority responsible of heritage and has all the register from all the museums in the country, including, for example, the site of Palmyra. And as you said, the site has, the city of Palmyra has experienced different kind of destruction and looting. But in general, all items since the beginning of the archaeological labor in Palmyra, almost 100 years ago, is well documented, well registered. And there is part of these items destroyed. I can say it's kind of propaganda, because these items exposed in the museum, it's well known for all the world, and maybe hundreds of thousands of people have images or selfie beside these statues or items. So ISIS in this case destroyed them and showed the people, we don't need antiquities, we destroyed them because our interpretation of the religion said we have to destroy these items. But at the same time, the other items, the other objects in the magazines or the other people haven't seen them before, were smuggled and sold on the black market.
Yes, and of course what is looted, I mean, from the ground now is not possible to trace in this way.
Exactly.
And I think we also have to follow up on I mean, the expertise to identify material. We are not strong on Western Asia in Sweden, I would say, but we will find the network to develop.
Yeah. Another point I would like to add in this case, I will give example from Palmyra from the funerary towers. Each one of them contained sometimes more than 500 people deceased in these towers. And each one of them was faced by a portrait on the limestone. So the radical group of Daesh destroyed these towers, and now it's impossible to know if these items were looted or destroyed. So they applied the destruction to cover looting activities in this case.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So Sam? Yes, every battalion and everybody else. Huh? Even in Sweden, as you may know, some of you may have been here some years ago when we had the seminar, and our embedded journalist Johanna Hildebrand told about how the Swedish soldiers in northern Afghanistan, fighting under the banner of NATO, bulldozed their way through. That, of course, the ancient pottery was exposed, and as she told us, she saved the pottery from the Afghans, because these Swedish soldiers, they had to find something, a hill, something to, because they were to hold a village. But they also knew that when they went away, the villagers, of course, living there would come back, and then they would loot the site. So she saved the pots for Sweden without contacting our colleagues in Afghanistan. So, I mean, this is true. Yes, it happens everywhere, and also in-house in peaceful Sweden, in reputed national library and all over. But so, from your perspective, what remains apart from cynicism? I mean, if everyone does, okay, then I can also join. No, I mean, of course, we have had many examples here of, but from your point of view, and I know that you're also now in Amman, and I mean, you're close to the field. What do you have any idea?
When I was doing capacity building training a couple of years ago, a colleague interrupted me to reassure the law enforcement agents that I hadn't meant to be depressing. Because there really are things that we can do. I mean, yes, like the evidence that I have, I think shows that like there's a huge problem and it's very difficult to manage. But at the same time, Egypt has had great success in securing repatriations of its antiquities. Cambodia has had great success in securing repatriations, and also in using its cultural heritage as part of reconstruction in a post-genocide society. So if they can do those kinds of things, then other countries can, and countries who are outside zones of crisis and conflict can support them, whether it's by providing efficient policing, which is possible, and effective laws, as we've seen that can actually be effectively implemented, or whether it's through capacity building or regulation and simply through ethical behavior. So I think, yeah, it's quite grim, but it shows that there really are potential things that we can do in practice that would make a very significant difference if the relevant authorities and agencies chose to do them.
Thank you. And Frida, I mean, you gave it, you will publish your study in the end of this year, or your research, and then we will know we will be able, of course, we will have more meetings here in Sweden, and we will have with some concrete knowledge about how it looks here. But now I wanted to ask you, in relation to Markus' talk about the legislation in Germany, if Germany becomes more unsafe for illicit trade, and Sweden at the same time keep this legislation that we have, would that mean that, what is your comment? Could something happen with the Swedish market for antiquities then? I mean, Germany more unsafe, Sweden as it always has been, but now comparatively safer for illicit trade.
I should say for a start that Swedish import legislation is woefully lax. But at the same time, there are so many other factors determining what makes a good market country. For instance, border control, customs officers. And I heard Professor Hilgert speak of the new 2016 law, which sounds excellent in many aspects, but at the same time, of course, I am concerned about the free movement of objects, of goods within the European Union. That means as long as something comes from another country within the Union, we don't have to declare it to customs. And either we seize and control everything that comes into Sweden, either we could seize things from known transit countries, such as possibly Switzerland, such as Ukraine. But legislative, I do believe, as far as legislation goes, as far as legislation can take us, I see the German model as a great role model for us.
But yeah, so we have, you mean that we should think in terms of, or our parliamentarians should think in terms of?
We need to think of legislative elements, yes, and those are rather simple. Import ban of certain types of antiquities, or antiquities as a whole, unless they're provided with an export permit. But I think we need to attack the problem on other fronts as well. I think we need to attack it in customs offices. And that will be difficult. Providing every customs office with an archaeologist would possibly not be monetarily possible.
I'm not sure about finances, but if I may, I would like to second that, because I think it's a very important point. I'm happy to hear that Germany is being congratulated on its new law, but at the same time, let's not forget that a law is only as good as the people who implement it and who apply it. And I think this is the biggest problem right now, or one of the big problems right now internationally. We know very well what to do, but we're lacking the people and sometimes the expertise to actually do it. If you remember, I showed you one slide where I said we've identified 5,500 pieces from the Eastern Mediterranean archaeological objects over the last 18 months in the German market, in the open market. Now, of course, it's entirely possible that they all have expert certificates. Unfortunately, we don't know that. But who follows up on this? Who actually goes to the dealer, talks to him or her, and asks for the documents? Where are the police officers that go to fairs and ask for expert certificates? And this is where we have a huge problem. I admire you when I hear that you, as one person, one expert, is working on this massive project for the entirety of Sweden. Germany, as you know, has 2.5 staff at the National Criminal Police who deal with cultural heritage crime or cultural crime in general. Belgium, as was mentioned earlier, has closed its unit. There are shortages of expertise and staff in other countries as well, and Maria Miñana very rightly mentioned the north-south divide that we shouldn't forget. So right now it's very much a problem of getting the expertise to law enforcement and customs, which is very important because it needs some kind of training scheme on a national level, and it needs a systematic training scheme. One class, one seminar is a wonderful thing, but it's never going to be enough because you have to do it every year, every 6 months, consistently. But then again, customs tells us, and it's understandable, where do they have the capacities to also deal with cultural heritage? They deal with watches, sneakers, you name it, you know this better than I do. So we also need to reinforce in terms of staff, in terms of personnel, law enforcement and customs. This is very important. If we don't do that, the laws can only be so effective. So if you ask what can we do on a national level, what's the way forward, we actually have to.
Then a question, but how come that the people who protect the natural heritage, I mean, bird eggs and crocodile skins and so on, they seem, even the customs officers here in Sweden say that, yeah, this we are working with, and we have 800 experts out in Europe, and we can ask anyone. And so how did they do? What is the difference? Huh?
Elephants are cute. I mean, let's. That's basically it. I mean, people care more when they see, understandably, when you see a rhino with its horn cut off dying in the road, then people are going to care more automatically than when they see a smashed pot or something.
So it's a question about the buyer. We don't reach the buyer's heart. Is that a thing?
I mean, buyers certainly lack shame, but also there's a lack of public imposition of shame. Because there's a lot more interest when people see wildlife trafficking than when they see antiquities trafficking. Because of the immediate effect of the photographs and the understanding of what's happening to the animals, or because people don't make the connection between the antiquities and the communities from which they've been stolen.
And what the money could be used for that is gained via this. So this is a thing to reach the heart of each and every one, to create the same kind of feeling in relation to the cultural heritage as people have for crocodile skins and
I think that what every information campaign in this area needs to accomplish is to create the connection between the culture object that they're buying, which doesn't solicit a great deal of emotional response to the normal person, to the financing of the atrocities of the terror organizations. And I think, to be very practical, we need to focus on ISIS because they're the Nazis of the 21st century.
Yeah. The problem with this is that obviously there is also a lot of trafficking in Latin America, for instance, when there is not a direct link with terrorism. So I totally agree with you, and that's the approach that UNESCO is taking, is to, when it comes to the illicit trafficking in the Middle East region, is to link it to terrorism. However, what happens with other regions in the world, where there is an acute problem of illicit trafficking, but it's not directly linked to terrorism. So we need to tackle it from different angles. It's also true that wildlife trafficking is something which has been, let's say, in the news for a very long time. I mean, I remember from the early 80s, but however, for illicit trafficking and for the protection of cultural heritage, I think that it's an issue which is right now much more visible and more on the security agenda than it was before. So we're trying to reinforce our discourse, but still, I agree with Sam that it's difficult to reach the heart of the buyers because it's a different issue. And also, it's a much more complicated issue because how many thousands of experts do we need for the verification of the authenticity of the objects. It's which, I mean, we have spoken about it several times with Markus too, and that's a problem that we have when we have, we strengthen border controls, we train police and customs, but then when it comes to the verification of the object, we need a huge expertise network, which is another added problem to the cost.
Thank you. And I have a question for you, Maria. Because you have given us many examples of the initiatives taking from, I mean, the international UNESCO level. And of course, each country has to work, I mean, from its own specific situation. So, and that is the responsibility of ourselves. But from your point of view, what would you say? I mean, a country like Sweden, fairly rich, member of the EU. So as Frida gave example of, there are open borders, no customs control. And apart from with Norway, of course, but yeah. At present, no knowledge about the volume of trade with illicitly exported artifacts. We think there is such a thing going on, but we don't know. But what would you, I mean, from your perspective, now I'm not asking you to put yourself in our position. I want you to be there at the international level, looking around. And so for a country like Sweden, what do you think would be the important things to do in this field now for us?
Well, I think that Sweden has already taken many initiatives, as I mentioned before, but I think that there is still maybe room for improvement when it comes to the national legislation, when it comes to import controls, and especially when it comes to the training of police, for instance, and also to build up a network of expertise at the national level for the verification of cultural objects. And also, these are maybe short, mid-term proposals, but in the long term, I think it's very important to integrate the issue of illicit trafficking and cultural protection in school curricula, in university curricula, so that it becomes part of the social consciousness, which is the first step, I think, for a sound protection of heritage in the long term. So there are many initiatives which can be taken into consideration, also including the training of museum officials, governmental officials, awareness raising, and more specifically too for the art market in Sweden. So if you can also launch communication campaigns for the art market so that people know that they cannot purchase these kind of objects, it will definitely help.
Thank you. So now it's your time to communicate with our specialists, though it's late in Friday afternoon, but maybe some energy is left. Do we have...
Sorry, excuse me, can I add something to what Maria said? What were the efforts, not only from Sweden, I'm talking generally in every country, when the same problem was in Egypt, when the problem is now in Yemen and is ongoing, and it was before, when the problem will be naturally somewhere else in due course. Have we mapped that? Have we mapped them effectively and monitor them, and now we stop because we have Syria and Iraq? Are we going to go back to Syria and Iraq when tomorrow will be someone else, a conflict zone, or we will have as a fashion a new focusing in that one, fearing if these objects will come into our country or in any country in the Western world? That's why I'm talking about effective monitoring in an international level, understanding the market regardless of the specific types of objects, focusing on the illegality of any object and understanding how the market is bypassing this illegality. Because this we will have it in the future with a different conflict zone, with a different opportunity, and we will what? Find ourselves in a new targeting of objects and types of objects and so on, and we will put aside Syria and Iraq until it happens again to Iraq, for example, that happened before and now and will happen again, hopefully not. It's a question, we can discuss it.
If I may.
Please.
No, I totally agree with you, Christos, on the need for, of course, international monitoring of illicit trafficking, but as we all know, it's a monumental task. So from UNESCO side, for instance, we rely a lot on the reports that we receive on the implementation of the convention. But some of these reports are not comprehensive enough. We also provide assistance to states to complete these reports. But ideally, projects such as Illicit and what Sweden is doing too should be done at the global scale. But for this, means are needed, and also political will is needed, because if we really want to monitor, we need facts and we need information. And even at the level of the 2199 Security Council resolution, we have realized that there is a huge amount of information and that states are not really sharing this kind of information because it relates to terrorism and it's classified information. So that's one of the problems of the topic, is that data concerning trafficking. Ideally, of course, we should have a way of monitoring this market, but it's very challenging. And so we rely on the will of states like Sweden to help us too.
So, yes. Emma, do we have anyone, or shall I run around? I can.
Thank you very much for your papers. I'm sitting here during this day and listen to you, and I wonder, how is the market actually working? Well, we have an antique market. Most of it is probably, I hope, legal. I don't know. In other ways, it's not legal. But I don't think we have analyzed how is the market constructed. I think in many, if you look, for example, for other markets, we know fairly well about how the market for petrol and things like that is organized, and you have different. But here, I think everything seems to be just coming up. We are seeing some problems. And what I think is the greatest problem here is that we have a market, a global market, and we have collapsed states. States that have definitely collapsed. And they take part, and other groups take over the market in that case. And this I would like to have your opinion on.
Well, I think if what you're asking is the problem is that the market isn't regulated, which it very rarely isn't.
Which market, which global market today is regulated?
The oil market, for instance.
We have a global market.
Yes. Well, I was discussing more the arts and antiquities and antiques markets on a national level. They're bound very often, if they're a major player in the field, they're bound by ethic guidelines. They're not bound by them at all, of course. They take great liberty with these ethic guidelines, which often quite detail quite specifically about the research of provenance, about due diligence. I think they're mainly there for show in a lot of cases. From the insight I've gotten to the Swedish market, but perhaps...
I would like to second that. I would say the very same thing also for Germany. It's a market that has not been very regulated for decades, if not to say forever. And this also explains the outcry at the 2016 German law, because for the first time there was some sort of stronger regulation demanded from the market. Can you imagine buying a car without proof of who's owned the car before and what state is in? Of course, I mean, I don't know about you, but most people wouldn't do that. Can you imagine buying a prescripted medicine without actually knowing what it's good for, what you do with it, what the side effects may be? Probably you can't. And these things that we deem absolutely normal in other areas of the consumer market are not necessarily true for the art market. And this is why everything that has been discussed today is so hard to grasp and to put numbers to, because there is virtually no regulation. And this has to change, because the fact that there is no regulation has not to do with the fact that it doesn't need to be regulated, but there is a very strong lobby that doesn't want it to be regulated.
I think if I may just add to that, you compare this with buying a car. Cars are, in most Western countries, featured on public registers. You can see exactly what who's owned them before and if they've been in a crash. Objects are very different. There are no public registers, and I don't think it's possible to have a public register of the ownership history of an object. Not even within the context of one country such as Sweden. Objects don't have passports. We can't trace the movements of one object through the Middle East to Europe. And we don't know how it got here, and what's quite important, we don't know when it came here. A person selling a Syrian antique can, of course, tell the buyer this was exported in 1960, 3 years before the export ban came into force. But I think you touched a little bit upon that. You showed quite clearly the very open lies a lot of very large auction houses deal with when presenting the ownership history.
Yes, thank you. I would like to add also that the antiquities market seems to be the only market in the world where prominent dealers, the people who are leading the market, well, they are found repeatedly breaking the law, they are not removed from the market, they are not being jailed, and they continue instead to rule it. It's the only market in the world that this is happening. There is no other market where you can repeatedly identify someone who is breaking the law and is not eventually, if not in the first instance, being removed from the market, from whatever it trades. Why?
I think they must apply the Syrian antiquities law.
Everywhere. Everywhere, everywhere, everywhere.
To add another thing to the answer, because the market also organized by law or by international laws. In this case, there are more challenges. For example, for items coming out of the conflict area. Yesterday we discussed this with Eva. For example, items coming out from Syria. It's legally, in the European Union, it's legally forbidden to deal with this kind of items. But the challenge here is the same object could be from the neighboring countries. Since the national borders now, 100 years ago, it was established, doesn't correspond with the cultural unity before. So the same object from Syria, you can find it easily in Iraq or in Turkey or in Iran. So this is one of the challenges in this case.
Roman objects can be found the same types in over 20 countries now, because that was the expansion of the Roman Empire. Just an example of the difficulties. I don't think that there are difficulties that they cannot be managed eventually. Effective monitoring can acquire and gather information from at least a certain point onwards, if cannot be made possible from the very beginning because of conflict issues, because of low financial crisis or whatever. At some point, they are reaching reputable markets. Why not recording all this information from this point onwards, comparing it when it reappears, and see the illegalities that appear from the comparison of the market itself in different instances. That's one way. There are possible other ways, especially effective, like the two ones that have been presented by Germany and Sweden now. So it's a good start. It's a great start. But it has to be...
So one more question from the audience, and then we give a chance for every speaker to say what they still want to share with us. And then we will have the final, yes. Oh, sorry. Then, okay, two.
Two.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all your interesting presentations. I have one question about we talk about Syria and Iraq, and there are many old civilizations there, and I guess we all agree that old things are an important part of our cultural heritage. But I want to stress that there are also modern cultural heritage, and I think it's a scary development in society if we allow the modern history to be erased. So I want to ask you, how old is the cultural goods in your opinion, when you think it's worth to really care about this? I'm thinking about, I mean, there can be modern museum with a lot of interesting, unique ideas and thoughts. And if you just let all these things go away, you tend to, it's very easy to brainwash people from modern ideas.
Can I start? Because Germany just dealt with that. I think maybe this is a misunderstanding. I think the fact that we've been concentrating on Iraq and Syria doesn't mean that cultural heritage protection starts 3000 BCE and ends 500 AD. In fact, every state and every member state of UNESCO has the right, actually the obligation, to define what kinds of cultural property are important to the state, what kinds of cultural property has national importance. And as you well know, this has not necessarily to do with age, but with national importance. So, or in addition to which, there's also the immaterial cultural heritage, which is not only stressed by UNESCO with a separate convention, but also by member states who know very well that this is an important good of functioning societies. So I don't think you should conclude from this discussion that we do not care about contemporary cultural heritage, because obviously we do, and it's just, you know, one part that probably also because of the political situation has gotten more attention, but that doesn't mean that we focus exclusively on that.
No? Yeah. I would like also to add some point here, because for the definition of an item or a monument, for example, in Syria, in the Syrian law, it should be 200 years old, or in Spain, it's 180 years old. So, in general, the chronological criteria is applied in this case. But at the same time, it's possible to add items or monuments with special importance, natural importance, religious importance, more newer than this criteria. And maybe the natural heritage also has its importance for the UNESCO and all the countries of the UNESCO.
Yeah, just to add that in the 1970 convention, it's 100 years. But as Markus was saying before, it's really up to the state to define which cultural property should be protected.
So, would you like to pose your question? Yes.
Perhaps it's a too big question. My name is Katarina Nolin. I come from the Stockholm University. Eva and Sam, you were talking about reaching the heart. And Maria, you were talking about that trafficking has been on for decades, or for very, very long time, of course, for centuries. But I was thinking about that in Sweden, at least, I think that for many people, trafficking means something else. Trafficking means women and children. And I wonder if some of you could say something about the relation between the trafficking of illicit cultural goods and the trafficking of women and children, for example.
Well, in fact, I was going to make the link with trafficking of drugs. In one of the presentations before, we were discussing about the controls made in ports, for instance. In Latin America, many times, when they are trying to find drugs, they actually find cultural objects with drugs inside. And the problem is that the customs officers, they destroy the cultural objects because they are not even aware of the fact that these are cultural objects, and they're just trying to find the drugs. So we are really trying to work with other UN agencies like UNODC to highlight the links between illicit trafficking of cultural goods and other kinds of trafficking, because sadly, it's also a way for UNESCO to give more visibility to the topic. And in fact, we were trying to launch a campaign with the World Tourism Organization, which was called Travel, Don't Traffic. And it actually tackled many different kinds of trafficking: cultural goods, wildlife, drugs. And we're trying to launch this so that we give a comprehensive view to the traveler of the things which should not be done when traveling.
Sorry, can I add to that? I totally agree. Within Greece, with the Greek Police Art Squad, several times during raids targeted either for drugs, they found also guns or antiquities and vice versa. A big question internationally is whether traffickers in humans, human trafficking, were the ones who initiated the paths that other smuggling organizations have followed because they have been successful with humans. It may be the vice versa, in depending on the country, because now we have, because of the new wave of immigration from Near East, we have examples even that reach the press that we have people being trafficked into suitcases, which was a traditional back in the 60s and 70s, even after the UNESCO Convention, way of trafficking objects. So who started what and who followed successfully what have been started by someone else. It is very probable that up to a big proportion, if not all, the same people who are involved in trafficking in drugs definitely are being involved also at least occasionally with trafficking antiquities. Because they can smuggle them in the same way and because the paths have been tested in various other ways.
Also, if I may add, because the international mafias who deal with illicit trafficking of cultural property are sometimes the same, which are trafficking with drugs, arms, or any other kinds.
Just you give me one point to the other. If any of you have read the first book by Roberto Saviano, Gomorrah, the person who is the Italian journalist who is living under custody in a secret place because he revealed all the secrets of mafia. The very first page starts in midnight in the port of Naples, where no one is there, and when a ship arrives, immediately the port becomes very crowded, taking off the ship big wooden crates. One falls, it breaks, and there are dead Chinese workers who paid part of their salary working near like slaves in order to, when they die, if they die, to be shipped to be buried in China. of course, illicitly all this because they are already dead. Just one example of smuggling in crates that otherwise they would have any kind of material goods, and they have human, until recently lived, live people. Sorry, end of the...
Just specifically in relation to trafficking and smuggling of people, there are cases where, as in West Africa and the movement to North Africa, people pay for the service of being smuggled by either selling or bartering cultural property. And in other cases, yeah, as we've been saying, with the movement, people move different commodities, and unfortunately they are as happy to traffic humans for sex or other labor as they are to traffic antiquities and everything else.
So, thank you so much.